Hey, what's up? It's Matt for 360 Investigations, and welcome to episode 7 of A Journey in the Making. I know that the title of this video is a little strange because it says clarification through story time. So in order for you to understand exactly what led up to me making this video, I'm going to have to backtrack it through stories and then use those stories to get the clarification across on what I'm talking about. Because right now, for the past couple of videos I've made about me talking about people not hiking the AT, commenting about, Captain Jack and Bob Ross, I have a bunch of angry people at me because they dislike what I'm talking about. So they're asking me, hey, where did you get this information, that and the other thing? This, that, and the other thing. And even despite me showing them, it's like it's being ignored and it's getting exhausting talking to people because I wind up spending more time correcting people's false statements and what they're saying than I am making educational videos. So what I'm using this video for is to completely clarify everything I'm talking about once and for all, and then I'm never going to bring it up again. I'm just basically going to stop talking to people because it's getting out of hand. So that being said, story time, and it will all be clear at the same, all be clarified in this. So I'm going to talk about a positive in this before I get into kind of this downplaying shit, is while I was talking to one person, we came to the realization that we were using the word hostile completely differently, even though we were talking about the same thing. We agreed on what the definition was, but the locations of where they weren't the same thing, and neither one of us knew it. So it is always a good idea to talk to people. However, that being said, it's still an exhausting endeavor to keep correcting people. So let me begin by addressing why I'm deleting certain comments underneath my videos, because people are angry about that. In one of my videos, I explicitly state there's nothing wrong with going to hostels or hotels, and if you want to hike that way, all the power to you. The person put a comment underneath the video, well, if you have such a problem with people going to hostels and hotels, I stopped reading and immediately deleted the comment. The person got mad, deleting the comment, saying, why are you deleting my comment? And I deleted that one. Because I'm not going to have people basically state ridiculous comments like that after it explicitly states in the video, that's not what I said. So, that's just to clear that up. If you put stupid comments underneath my videos, I'm going to delete them. All right. Next, I have a person taking a section of a video I was talking about a specific subject matter in, splicing it with a totally separate video, and then combining them together to formulate something and say I said something I never did. Now, after I pointed it out saying, hey, I never said this, they go, them saying it turned into, well, that's what's implied. And I said, that's not what it's implied because I'm very clear about what I say. Then it turned from that into, well, people take it that way. There was no winning with this person on that regard. So I stopped again. I'm going to stop talking to people because this is getting exhausting. It's like you can't win. Next, there is, when I was talking about the history of hostels on the trail, people use the phrase, hey, hostels and hikers have always been part of the trail. No, they haven't. The history explicitly states that hostels were like fire towers in the regard that they were only there for forest rangers and kind of the personnel that were looking over the woods. They eventually then got bought by private owners, which were then turned into respites for hikers. Keeping in mind, I explicitly stated that a fire lookout and a hostel are the same, that they were only allowing law enforcement in. Somebody took that and started saying, well, a fire tower is not a hostel, implying that I said they're the same thing, and they're not. That also was part of a conversation where people go, are you sure that's not a shelter you're talking about? I explicitly laid it out, showed a video or a picture of it, and they said, well, you sure you're not talking about a shelter? And it was ridiculous. That's absurd. So let me get into where I actually learned something off of this, which is the hostel and one of the other people I was talking about. All right, so I don't consider, this is just me personally in my opinion, I don't consider a hostel anything in a public area such as a town or a city. Even though they're there, I personally don't consider that. even though it is. So that's just a personal thing. It's my opinion on that, even though I know that they are. So when somebody was talking about hostile, I was not applying in town. Even though they are, I just don't consider that, never looked at it like that. When the person was talking to me, he was saying the word hostile to me, not knowing that I wasn't applying it in town. He was saying it to me, and I didn't know he was applying it only to what was in town. Okay. The reason why that's a mess is because there are hostels along the actual trail. Okay? There's dozens of them. And by definition, a hostel is a privately owned cabin or lodge that's been converted by a private owner to offer respite to a hiker. Call it a lodge, call it a cabin, it's still a hostel because the definition of hostel is a privately owned, basically cabin that offers shelter and respite to hikers. That's what the definition of it is. The problem is when people are talking of all these YouTubers and people are talking about hikers going to hostels, they're for some reason ignorant that there's hostels actually in the woods, not just in town. And what blew my mind is the person that was talking to me about this apparently said he's been on the AT for like a while. Not on it, but he does sections of it. He somehow didn't know that hostels existed on the trail. So when he said it, he wasn't applying on the trail. And I wasn't applying it in town. So once we realized that, I go, oh, okay, that makes more sense. And now he understood what I was talking about when I said people are not hiking the trail, which I'm going to get into a story about that. So what was happening here is he said, I've never seen that. Okay. And then because we were talking about Captain Jack and Bob Ross and their hostels, before we got into that discussion about me understanding they were in town, I thought they were staying in the woods. I thought they were staying in town. So what wound up happening was that was cleared up and he goes, oh, I see. Now, then he understood what I was talking about because of the conversation we had. And then I go, are you starting to see what I'm having an issue with? Yeah, he goes, okay, but now that that's cleared up, do you understand this? I said, yes, keeping in mind that was specific to Captain Jack and Bob Ross. Now, he said to me, I've never seen this. Can you show me where this is? Give me examples of this where people are doing this on the trail. Keeping in mind, I said yes, because he was not aware that there were ones in the woods. And I don't understand how people don't know this. There's dozens of them along the trail in the woods, not in town, they're in the woods. Call them a cabin, call them a lodge, whatever you want. They're still hostels. So what happened is I explained to him, there are videos there are dozens of YouTuber videos that are showing themselves walking to these places in the woods, like it's on video. So he goes, all right, yeah, can you link me a few of these? He says, I don't know what you're talking about. So I said, okay, fine. So what I did was I went through this one YouTuber's videos and I found approximately 5 or 6 examples. I don't count the 6th one because I said, I'm not really sure where this is. I think it's in a state park, so I don't count it the same way. It's actually in a state park, but I'm not sure where this is. But I was just using this as an example because of the discussion we would have of what types of places this person was staying in. So I said the first 5 are actual examples of what I was talking about. I said, I linked them the video. I time-stamped where in the video it was. I explained what they were talking about. And I says, from this time and this time, here's the timestamp. But from this timestamp in the video, from the beginning of this to here, they're talking about the details of what this is, outlining the hostel. And then I said, from this timestamp to here is where they're showing it. I did this 5 times. They're in the woods showing this place, which is somehow, he's like, you sure not a shelter? And so I showed it to him. And then he cuts back to me. After I showed him, he says, well, I don't see how that doesn't really show what you're talking about. I'm like, I time-stamped it in the videos. They're videoing themselves walking up to a place in the woods that you asked me to show you. You're seeing it, and then you're saying, that's really not what you talked about. I said, there are people, there are YouTubers showing themselves walking to these places up in the woods on trail going to them. Can you show it to me? So I did, and he's like, well, that really doesn't show it. And then he reversed back to the Captain Bob and Captain Jack and Bob Ross thing, where he's like, well, we've already established that's what you were talking about, splicing the conversation together. No, we didn't. What Captain Jack and Bob Ross we were talking about on their hostel stay is there. But what he asked me to show him has nothing to do with that. And because I showed him this, he said, well, that's not really what it was. And of course, obviously, you were confused with this. I'm like, no, you asked me to show you where these YouTubers were walking into the woods up to these things. I gave you 5 timestamps showing you what they were talking about. And then you said, I didn't give you what you showed. So again, it's just exhausting talking to these people where all I'm doing is spending more time correcting this shit. So let me get into a story mode here to answer a question to people why I say that people like Captain Jack and Bob Ross are not hiking. I explicitly state that under various people's videos because they're not hiking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an analogy. And this is what people are using. This situation in general is what people are trying to use to argue. So, first of all, if 2 people are set up to take a test, one of them studies, goes through all of the work, puts in all the work, reads the books, does all the stuff, studies, and literally puts the work in. The other one has a cheat sheet where they just have all the answers written. Both of them go in, they both finish the test, and they both turn it in and pass. Okay. Only one of them took the test. There were people that will argue, well, they still had to, the person that cheated still walked in, they had to sit down, they had to write their answers out and turn them in as the argument for taking the test. When in reality, they're not taking the test because that's not what taking the test is defined as through the natural course of test taking. People are like, where do you get the definition of taking a test? Taking a test in the context of what it means is throughout the entire curriculum of school from whatever time frame in the 1900s or whatever it goes back to till now, literally has the context attached to and the definition of you study, you put the work in, you actually go in, you put your mind to it, you write it out, you put all the work in, you do it, and you pass it in. Taking the test literally means you have to put the work in. That's not an arguable debate, that's a fact. People trying to argue that somebody cheated, took the test just because they went in there, wrote it down, and then say, well, they had to turn it in, is not taking the test. They will argue it is because they're in the act of, well, did they write it down? That's not the definition of what taking a test means. You can argue that as a secondary point, but everybody knows what I'm talking about. People who cheat and do that shit have not been considered taking the test. That's why when you cheat on it, you're told to retake the test. You haven't taken it to begin with. You have to take the test, period. Sorry, that was a bad choice of words. But basically, people now know what I'm talking about when it comes to this situation. You are not taking the test. Just because you walked in, sat down, picked up the pencil and wrote on air and turned in does not qualify you to be defined as taking the test. You can't argue that point. You can't say that's an incorrect assumption because that's just what happened. That's how test taking works. It's a natural course of progression that has basically had its own definition defined due to how it's done. That's not an argument. That's a factual basis. So why do I bring this up? That is because from the 1970s till the early 2000s, hiking the AT has a very specific definition that was defined and weeded through and attached itself to the word hiking because of how the natural course is done through the hike. From the 1970s till the early 2000s, you had to put in the work. You did not have apps on your phone. You did not have rides to town. You had to figure out everything you're doing. You couldn't, there are people who paid various times to go in there, and that was far and few in between, so that did exist. But that would be the equivalency of people, who actually study. There were people who take tests by having people pay their way through, and, they're having other people take the test. Those people exist, but that's not what the bulk of this is. So the reason why I bring that up is because what will happen is, let me get to that afterwards, but basically backing up to what I was saying, from the 1970s to the early 2000s, hiking wind up having a very explicit set of definitions attached to it that meant when you said hiking the AT, you applied all the criteria that people were doing it from the 1970s to the early 2000s. That's what the definition of hiking is. So when people saying, so let me back up. This current generation of people going through or out on the trail are not hiking the trail in any way, shape, or form because they are going in with a cheat sheet, not putting in any work, and then claiming they're hiking the trail. If you're out for 50 days on the outside or supposedly on the trail, and you stay inside for 35 days, you are not hiking the trail. Reason why is because in the 1970s to the early 2000s, that was not a thing. Sure, there were a couple people here and there that paid to do it, but it is nothing like the shit show that's all people are doing now. The way people are going through the trail now is a manufactured way that's only become the way it is right now in the past 6 years. This was not a thing back in the 70s till the 2000s. Now, the reason why I specifically worded it that way is because if I don't clarify right now, the amount of times people are doing it to the extent they're doing it now was not done back then. What will happen is people will take what I said. The way people are doing it now, going inside and staying inside, you weren't able to do that in the 1970s till 2000s. People will say, well, some people paid to go through it, which isn't even what I'm talking about. They'll create an argument out of that, which they'll have to wind up correcting. So what I'm saying is, people paid from the 1970s to the early 2000s. There were people that occasionally paid to do this. But if you wanted to go to town, you had to hitchhike. You didn't get a ride. The 100-mile wilderness is a shit show now because the hostels have literally set up resupply points in the middle of in the woods. The woods had a sign, whether you were going northbound or south, going southbound or northbound. When you reach a certain point at those sections, there's a sign that says, do not go through here unless you have 10 days supply food or water because you have no way to resupply. That was a fact. The hostels came in and fucked that up and totally changed it. People are like, well, what's wrong with that? Because you fuck up the way the challenge on the trail is done by pulling that shit and turning it into a business. Now, the way people are doing it now with the amount of shit, this is all they're doing. All they're doing is they're going in to a test with cheat sheets and then claiming that just because they're writing the stuff down and they had to come in, they're somehow doing the test. Just because you're out walking is not you doing the trail just because you're out there. People are like, they're still walking. Well, people that cheated still wrote the test down. Taking the test and hiking the trail are not just simply going out there and paying to stay your way through. That's not how this works. Hiking literally has the definitions attached to it that were naturally progressed through the 1970s to the early 2000s. That's a fact. You can't get around that. That's not my opinion. Stating, well, why are you telling me? I'm not telling anybody they're supposed to be doing it anyway. What I'm saying here is, if you are doing all the bullshit that people are doing now by doing nothing but staying inside, barely doing any hiking and hostel hopping and hotel hopping, and barely spending any time in your tent, and going in town, then you are not hiking the trail. You're not. You're out for a leisurely stroll. And again, for those that want to try to argue, hiking the AT, the definitions of what defines hiking the AT come from 30 plus years from the 1970s to the early 2000s of people just naturally going through the trail the way they were doing it. They didn't have apps. They didn't have half of the shit that they have now. There was no I'm driving you to town crap. This was recently surfaced in the past 6 years and slowly became progressive to the point anytime you see anybody on the AT, 99% of them are doing nothing but that. Then arguing they're still hiking. No, you're not hiking when you're doing this manufactured, newer way that just slowly became commonplace. Just because you're out on the trail does not mean you're hiking. You are hiking the AT if you're using the definitions that were naturally strewn about for 30 years in the making. It's just through the natural course of progression. You can't argue that. People are changing that definition into this bullshit now and saying, well, they're still taking the test. Even though they didn't put any work, they're still taking the test. They still had to come to the class. That's not an argument. It's not a counterpoint. Just like saying, just because you're not staying in your tent, that's not a counterpoint. Because unless you are staying in your tent in the way you had to do it in the 1970s to the early 2000s, that's the definition of hiking. That is why I say, if you are doing anything except that, you are not hiking the trail. You don't get to call yourself a hiker, and that's the end of that. So this is where I'm getting my information from. So people are like, well, that's your opinion. Where do you get to define it? I didn't define it. The 30 years from the 1970s to the early 2000s defined it. That's what defines it. Not me, not you. And trying to argue that just because you're out on the trail for a specific section gets you to say, says I can call it hiking is not true. That's you trying to redefine what the term hiking is after 30 years have already defined it. So this is where I'm getting this shit from. And so let me get out one final point to this. All right. So again, using Captain Jack and Bob Ross as the two main problems with this, as I said, they're not hiking the trail. So let me go back to the conversation I had with the person. The person says Captain Jack and Bob Ross are staying in hostels. And he said, because they're naming their hostels, he knows where they are. Okay, so Hostel 1 is in this town, okay? Hostel 2 is in this town. Now, let's say that is 80 miles apart. Okay, fine. You're not going to hike 80 miles. What you're going to do is you're going to go an X amount of time and either get a ride to town. But what people are ignoring is that you don't have to go to town because there's hostels on the trail. So what's happening here is people like, oh, they're going all this way. No, they sporadically cover that distance. But what's happening here is they're not going from Hostel A in this town to Hostel B in this town. What they're doing is they're going from Hostel A here to Hostel on the trail, which is a shorter distance, then going from that hostel to the other hostel that's on the trail, and then going from that hostel to the one in town. They're actually doing 4 stops, not 2. So this is why I'm trying to tell people, people constantly going inside are not hiking the trail. And again, if you were out 50 days on the trail, and you have spent 35 of those days in town and off the trail, how are you even going to argue that you're hiking the AT? You're spending more time off the trail than you are on it. Hiking the AT literally has the attachment of camping, survivability, not getting rides into town, and working out your problems without running inside. Trying to use the excuse, well, people paid back then isn't a valid argument. Because while people did pay back then, it's nowhere near, it's far and few in between. Those are exceptions. Everybody's doing nothing but paying now. That's the difference. Everybody doing nothing but paying, sorry to tell you this, is not hiking the AT because they're hostel and hotel hopping. And when I say hostel, again, you're not going from point A in one town to 80 miles to point B in another town. You are stopping off at hostels that are actually in the woods, breaking up the amount of time you're walking into a shorter distance, making it extremely simplified to do no work. If you couldn't go into any of those things on town and you had to go from point A to point B and it's 100 miles and there were no hostels in that time frame, half of these people wouldn't do it because they need to go inside every chance that they possibly get. So what is happening here is, and this came from somebody else I was talking to. This isn't about them staying in there. This is about assholes who have basically taken what is supposed to be, I don't want to say an emergency out, but an out that you use on occasion to doing nothing but that and turning it into a business, which is how the 100-mile wilderness has been shot to hell. People are like, well, it's a good idea to put these supply points in. No, it's fucking not, because you destroyed the section of the trail that had a very specific point. Everybody's removing everything that made the trail of any difficult of importance, and are replacing it with, let's go indoors all the fucking time, let's go in, and then let's say, we're hiking the AT. Sorry, you're not. Once again, I'm going to keep drilling this home. If you are not doing it by the definition set for 30 fucking years between the 1970s all the way up to the early 2000s, then you're not hiking the trail. You're doing a manufactured way that has become commonplace, where people think just because they're out there, that gives them the right to say, I'm hiking the AT just because I'm out there. That's the equivalency of saying, just because you came in and wrote the test down from a cheat sheet, you're somehow still doing the test. No, you're not. The act of going through the motions and then pretending to do the test is not the same thing as actually doing the test. Going through the motions and sleeping inside and then saying, oh, while I'm out here, I'm just out here, I'm still out here walking, as if you didn't use a cheat sheet or any of these places, as if they don't matter, you don't get the luxury of saying you did it, because it's not hiking any more than somebody using a cheat sheet and going in saying, well, I still took the test. This is, again, I use the Mount Washington reference for this. If you're getting to the top of Mount Washington by getting a ride and you use the word climb, you are lying. You are not climbing Mount Washington. People are word manipulating this and saying, well, everybody's doing it now. How can you say they're not climbing it when they're out there doing it? Because they're getting a ride. It's like so ridiculous that this is even a thing. So, sorry I got a little worked up with this, but this is what I'm talking about. And now that it's been cleared up, I'm not getting into any more discussions about this. I wanted to explicitly go into detail because people are getting mad at me for talking about something that people are doing. And what really pissed somebody off is when I said, this is yellow blazing. It's just a different version of yellow blazing. No, they're not. Yellow blazing is skipping the trail. Staying inside every fucking time you do something is skipping the work on the trail. It's no different. They may not be doing the miles, but you're not putting in the work. It doesn't benefit anybody. So it's yellow. It's a different version of yellow blazing. You're skipping out on doing any actual work and then claiming you did the trail. And that pisses off hikers. But what I'm talking about doesn't? Give me a break. So yeah, this is my standpoint. And I'm just going to end this video with, as I said before, if I go out on the trail and I wind up having to stay in places, which I'm going to do, but I'm going to try to avoid like hell to go into any of them the way the current system is. And if I wind up doing that out of necessity or whatever, I will come back and I will say, I was a jackass. I'm sorry. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I was wrong. And I have no problems doing that. I understand that until I go out there. I get it. I'm just speculating here and there. But as far as the analogy is, I go, that's not an opinion. That's history and fact and what leads up to this. Trying to word manipulate this just because you're there is not an argument, nor is it a counterpoint. You literally have to put in the work which made the definitions what they are, and people are now trying to remove them and say they're still the same thing. It's not. Sorry, it's not. So again, I just wanted to clear that up. I know this is a little lengthy, but hopefully this gets to the point where, again, I'm trying to make everything educational. And again, make sure when you're talking to people, please don't get out of hand. If somebody does it, just leave it alone. Like, I'm just not going to, I'm done explaining this to people. So that's it. So stay safe. This is Matt for 360 Investigations. Stay tuned for part 8, whenever that's going to be. So that's it. Take care. Stay safe. Matt, 360 Investigations signing out. Have a good one.